Hello and good afternoon, and welcome back, fellow non-believers and women worshipers, if you happen to be one. This is the Women Atheists Unload, and this week we are discussing women of the Bible. Our special guests we have are Deborah Grace and Pat Lowinger. So tune in as we venture into knowing how the Bible portrays women and how often it reflects it differently than what the Bible often says, and look at the historical and cultural aspects of women in the Christian era. Stay tuned.
Clown fame, mud disease, a plague. We all love to hate, have to play the game, have to make a name. All our insecurities are on display. This is war with the enemy. Think that it was meant to be. Living in a time where disease is on every screen. I won't let them fester me. I know most are festering. Negativity is a plague for the mentally weak. No mercy, all I got is working. Never stop searching, never quench the thirst.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I like that new intro song. Not gonna front. When I last heard it, I was like, ooh, that's hot. Anyways, hi there. Welcome back. I am going to be one of the co-hosts for the Women Atheists Unload show. Partnering alongside with me is the none other than Cynthia. I want to say Cynthia and Cindy at the same time. Cindy Plaza, how
Hi.
are you, my dear?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
Good, doing well. And you did preface you are experiencing a storm. So, of course, if you happen to drop out or cut out, we all will surely understand. But hopefully, God, Zeus, whoever we pray to, brings you back to us. That is the hope.
Hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully, yes. Well, let's not further delay. Cindy, you want to bring in one of our guests for this afternoon, or shall I?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. Well, like I mentioned, we do have Deborah Grace with us, author of Crucifying the Bible. It's so lovely for you to join us. Might I add, you look fabulous in orange. Orange is definitely your color.
Thank
I'm
you.
just going to say that.
Thank you.
And love the haircut too. Yes. Pleasure for having you with us today. And also we have none other than the great archaeologist, Pat Lowinger. I am a fan. He has a book coming out himself. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. I don't know, like great archaeologist. I'll just say archaeologist.
Okay,
So.
that's fair. I know I prop you up too often. That's probably my fault. But like I mentioned, we have an interesting kind of 2-point topic to discuss as far as women around the Christian Bible, I will add. So one of the aspects I know from Deborah's line of work is discussing about not only different women as far as within the Bible, but also referencing how we can often portray them wrong or incorrectly, I should say. Or I know I had mentioned before the show growing up when I would, be raised up in church and be fed these little girl Christian ideas of how to be a good woman, is that they would often portray certain characters like Esther and I want to say, I can't remember the other one right now. Not Hannah. Not even Eve. Not many people want to talk about Eve. She's always portrayed as the bad one, like the worst of the worst. And always in a sense, right, exactly. And always in the sense of, this is the way a woman should act, and this is how they did wrong, but they corrected themselves. So this is how a woman or a little girl should model herself once she becomes a woman. But I want to know as far as what you've experienced as far as women of the Bible in that regard.
Me? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, so my goodness. Like you said, from the very beginning, Eve has poisoned the well of humanity for everyone for all time. And she is cursed. Adam is not cursed. The ground is cursed for Adam's sake, but Adam is not cursed.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at it, it's all gaslighting because God is the one that planted the tree. He he created the serpent. On and on. We can go and pick the book of Genesis apart ad nauseum. But some of the other ones that aren't so well known, like Ruth, right? So people are like, oh my gosh, she was the one that proposed to Boaz. Okay. But let's look at that. She laid down at his feet and then before the sun comes up, he shoos her away so there's no visible nobody can think there was impropriety done, right? That was the man's place. So she's shooed out of there, right? You have Isaiah's wife. Not even a name is mentioned. And if you look at Betula or Alma, however you want to say it, she was young. She was very young. So if the Christians want to juxtapose those two words onto Mary, Mary was only 12 years old. I mean, come on.
Right.
Deborah, people think she's this great, wonderful person in the Bible. She is not even given the honor of judging Israel for 40 years inside the temple. She judges Israel between two trees on a hilltop. So we can get into more later, but there's my intro.
And there's Lot's daughters.
Yes. Lot's daughters, even the wife who remained nameless.
Yeah,
'Cause
Lot's wife
she
was
was
nameless.
Right. Lot's wife is nameless because she committed the ultimate thing, which she looked back at the city and turned herself into stone. So
What a terrible thing to do.
terrible, utterly terrible. But that's just it, right? The most utterly terrible thing a woman could do. It's it doesn't fall on deaf ears to be like, well, what was her name? It doesn't matter because she did not do anything more, I guess you could say, purposeful or relevant enough other than she committed a sin and turned herself to stone. So why even give a name to such an individual?
Right. But I mean, Isaiah's wife is a prophetess and she's not even named in scripture. So I mean, that to me, that's just like, why? I mean, there's only 5 prophetesses in the entire Bible, and one of them's not even named.
I want to say, because in looking at this, because I did my I never knew how many accounts or how many references of women are in scripture. So I, Google search, typical, general search of how many are there. I didn't get a rough count, but there is not much as far as, like you said, not many prophetess. I think I counted at least 4. I think I skimmed over one that was nameless, like you said, Isaiah's wife. And one of them that impacted me, even though, and especially since this was often given reference to myself, is Jezebel. Because of the idea that she manipulated, or in plain terms, manipulated the king and doing her own will towards things, and I can't recall what was the good aspect of what was relayed to me as a child about Jezebel, but I know that that was just an example of a woman that could be virtuous, that can stand her own, but still lean on a man. I don't know how they twisted that for me. That's just how I grew up on. But I know from Pat's point of view, the more historical and cultural aspects of it, it's way more interesting than what scripture can ever offer us.
Well, all I'm going to say is that misogyny was well represented throughout the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean. We look at, from a Christian perspective and a Jewish perspective, we look at Eve, right? But the Greeks had Pandora. Again, a woman is the archetype of the fall of man. Again, it's God setting the stage, in this case, Zeus, right? The supreme deity, basically creating a gift that Pandora cannot refuse but to open. But upon opening it, she lets all the trouble of chaos and etc. out into the world. And depending on which mythological tradition you want to follow, all she does is try to put the lid back on, and all she stifles for mankind is hope. So she not only brings evil into the world, but denies mankind of hope. So I think given that, we can really kind of look at the historical context culturally of how scapegoating women and then using mythical traditions to suppress them culturally. Because what this is, you need a mythical explanation on why women are bad. And if you can point to a myth and say, well, women are the root of all evil, now you can have all kinds of misogynistic bullshit come out behind that because it supports it culturally.
Oh,
And if
look
you're a
at
misogynist,
look at Samson and Delilah. Like God could have at some point told him, "Stay away from Delilah. She's bad. She's going to ruin you." No, he just stays silent. And Delilah, yeah, okay, probably not the best person on the planet, but she is represented in the Bible just annihilating any respect for women to the nth degree. I mean, it's really bad.
Yeah. I think that, if you look at like the concept of a prophetess in the Old Testament, right? And you look at Jewish rabbinical tradition, you only have, I think there are named 7 major prophetesses, right? You got Sarah, Miriam, Deborah, Hannah, Abigail, Huldah, and Esther, right? Sorry, I had to look at my notes from my research. And then you have other Jewish writings, right? Like Noadiah, who's in Nehemiah. And then you have unnamed prophetess of the future in Joel, right? So, and then you have the daughters of prophecy in Ezekiel. And then there's the unnamed prophetess who is the mother of Maher Shah Hazabin. And that's, you got these other people, right, that are in there, but these women, a lot of them are unnamed, and a lot of them are either culturally adjacent to Judaism or outside Judaism. So even in those contexts, you really have to look and try to get a detailed understanding of how women are represented. And then even when they're a prophetess, their role's usually pretty minor as far as what's written about them.
Can I play devil's advocate for a minute and
Sure.
ask a question? Maybe can we say that we're counting the hits and avoiding the misses? Like, there are a lot of horrible men in the Bible, and so is it fair to describe what we've been describing so far, that the Bible is misogynistic and the society as well at the time? Can we say that?
Yes. Okay, so I want to just go to the story of the Exodus, and there's a passage of scripture that talks about Aaron and Miriam asking Moses if they can be, or if they are, spokesmen for God as well. And God only punishes Miriam. Both Aaron and Miriam were discussing and talking about, can we be, or are we mouthpieces for God? But only Miriam was punished and given leprosy. And Moses had to step in and plead on her behalf for her to be healed. There is the only takeaway that you can possibly get from that is God was like, how dare this woman think she's on the same level as a man? So, I mean, there's that.
No, I think that's fair. No, go ahead, Pat.
And I don't know if we should go one for one, right, on this one man, one woman as depicted in the Bible. I think we have to look at archetypes, right? Like when you look at Eve as an archetype in literature, again, comparing to other mythical traditions like Pandora, right? Looking at how men are portrayed as archetypes, the archetype of Noah, again, other flood mythologies, surprise, there's more than one. And these are important for us to create narratives that give us cultural understanding. And, without being overly generalizing too much, the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East were patriarchal, misogynistic, and that was the cultural norms of the period in time. Women are largely still seen as property among many of these cultures too, to be exchanged and barter, not too much different than cattle. So yeah, it's fair. It's a very fair analysis to say that these societies were patriarchal and misogynistic and had both legal and, if you want to call them social systems that by modern standards are antithetical to what we're trying to achieve today.
And there's also what the Bible writes down, like saying in 2 Timothy that a woman cannot teach, she cannot hold a position of power. It's written black on white. So
yeah.
Now, Pat, can I ask you, have you thought about the scrubbing of Asherah in this discussion?
So sure, you mean the total cultural removal of a female divine figure from early
Yeah.
Judaism? Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, from again, not my area of expertise or specialization, but I mean, I've read a little bit on it, and the the decoupling of a traditional male female paired divinity, which were pretty common in ancient Mesopotamia, Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. That decoupling was a shift towards monotheism, right? So you have to, if you're going to be a monotheist, you can't have a paired divinity. So, and that's what happened within Judaism.
Well, and you can't be a patriarchal and misogynistic religion or ideology without scrubbing a goddess from the narrative.
The Romans did pretty well. So did the Greeks. The Greeks had, female divinities. The Mesopotamians had female divinities, and those societies were largely patriarchal. But what typically the chief deity is male, right? And then there's
right.
like adjacent, slightly subordinate female divinities. Even when you have Jupiter and Juno, right? Jupiter is the supreme deity, immediately adjacent to his wife, right? And then their daughter Minerva.
Right, but if you looked at, I think that there are some scholars that have paired the Aramaic Asthera, I think is how you pronounce it, with Asherah, and that they were one and the same. But if you look at the etymology of the Aramaic version, it meant mother of all gods. So she would have been the top above all the male gods at one time. In she was actually there are still 40 references, I believe, to Asherah in one way, shape, or form in the Bible, but it's definitely been cut down. Tongue in cheek there.
Well, there were numerous goddesses referred to as the great goddess, or the greatest goddess, or mother of the gods, right? Like the goddess, and again, Greek tradition is Kybele, right? Or Mater or Mater in Phrygia. There were feminine deities who were supreme deities, for lacking a better term, but then their roles, society shift and change, a shift towards a more rigid patriarchal system, some movement away from deities that, again, are moving towards male-dominated, male-centric projections.
So even though we had these female or women figures that, obviously we know how reproduction works. Only a woman can give, or a woman with those organs or bits, I like to call them, can give birth to, children. So, having that idea of, sure, this is the head mother of such and such belief, whatever, give your name to it, insert here. It is still more geared towards the man dominating this realm, this culture, this society.
Yeah, a goddess can be the mother of all gods. That doesn't mean necessarily that she's going to be the goddess queen of all of them, because being the mother doesn't mean she's the queen.
Well, something I not to correct you guys, but that's not how fertility and was understood in the ancient world. Women had no control over birth. Women were vessels to give birth. Men provided all that was necessary for birth. In a Greek context, Greco-Roman, and in many cultures, not all, but many of the cultures in the ancient Mediterranean, men donated the entire seed. Women acted solely as a vessel. So think of a lot of the concept is women only serve as the it's often referred to as like the jar, right? The jar for where, so not only is sex, but fertility is a male-dominated trait in a lot of these cultures, and it was societally projected that way.
God, that's even more dark and discouraging.
Yeah, but what about the oldest? I know this is kind of moving a little bit away from the biblical aspect of it, but from my research, the oldest figure that was worshipped was a female torso that was pregnant.
Yep. Or represented fertility. Yeah, those are the oldest throughout the Mediterranean, the oldest depictions we have that we are comfortable calling divine beings or representations of divine beings that have identifiable humanistic forms associated with them are largely feminine.
Right. And so that's another reason why I in doing all this research that I'm doing, It's even more discouraging when you look at the scriptures and you go, oh my gosh, you have so much misogyny throughout, and way more so than I ever thought. In the studies that I'm doing right now. But
Yeah.
I mean, if you even look at who was the other one I was going to bring up? The Samaritan woman, right, from the New Testament. She's crying out to Jesus, please help save my daughter. She's vexed with a demon. And ignore. The disciples are like, what do you want to do with this woman? And he can't be bothered. He finally turns and says, what do you want me to do? Give that which belongs to the children of Israel to the dogs? I mean, he said he came not for the rest of the world. He came for the lost sheep of Israel. That was his mission, his purpose. So for this woman to be crying out, and I know a lot of apologists will be like, oh, it's just showing her faith, So she has to grovel to say, well, even the dogs get crumbs. But if you look at I think it's kunarion is the Greek word, you can literally translate that to little bitch.
It's
Jesus
funny how,
himself.
yeah.
I mean,
this
is the stuff that I look at and go, why are women fighting for this?
Right. No, exactly what I was going to. It could be as simple as a man, I forget who I'm trying to reference here, just uttering God's name in the wind and just saying a simple line or phrase, and an angel miraculously appears, or God's voice miraculously is heard. And yet a woman has to beg, plead, die, bleed, all that stuff, just to maybe get an eye turn.
To get crumbs off the table that belong to the dogs. Yeah.
See, I look at that, and yes, it looks pejorative towards women, but a woman is the vehicle for an ethnocentric projection from within inside Judaism. He's calling her a dog because of who she is and the people she comes from, not necessarily because she's a woman. In my opinion, I mean, That's one of those cases where it was a woman groveling, but she was from the wrong race of people. And that's particularly why Jesus is referring to Israel, because it's not for you. I don't care what you need. But groveling in front of men, that was a common trope in the period of the time. You look at women come up, and the woman who comes up and grabs Jesus' robe after the incident with Lazarus. Why does she do that? She grovels at his feet, touches his robe. Men, aren't required to do that. Women have to sneak up and touch him because of the prohibitions against women having an equal place and equal standing in the society of the day. And that was just how the literature developed. The woman groveling was something like every man would have been like, yeah, obviously. I mean, I hate to be like that guy, but it was, and again, you got to say, well, and not only is she a woman, but she's a woman from a people that we aren't even supposed to touch, that they are the Samaritans are non-touchables from a Jewish context. Remember, this is, within a few decades, there's going to be a war between the Jews and the Samaritans. They're going to destroy the Samaritan temples. They're going to, even though Samaritans saw themselves as Jews, they weren't seen as Jews by the people in that were considering themselves ethnically Jewish. Samaritans saw themselves as the true children of God, and had a very similar cultural system in place. This is those things that it's bad all the way around. It's racist, it's misogynistic, it's all the worst things rolled into one thing. And but then apologists want to go, well, it's an object lesson. Is it? So Jesus is allowed to be a racist and a misogynist, and that's totally cool?
Right.
Right. By all means, middle of the show. And I want to kind of, I had a question to kind of broaden this a little bit, because I'm very curious. But yes, don't forget to like most of our shows, like all of our shows, like them all. You should. And we'll try to answer some of your questions later on in the show. By all means, if you have questions at any point in time, we have our awesome producers in the back working hard, watching the chat, responding to comments. By all means, we want to save your questions for the end with our guests. So please, please, please answer and leave your questions with us. I wanted to it's kind of broadening this, because I'm really curious. So this is just all me being selfish. Since like Deborah had referenced, the oldest, I guess you could say, worshipped idol or god or something that was like the oldest, most seen visual aspect of like something to be worshipped over was the torso of a pregnant woman. Where would either of you say would the transition of worshiping that which people at the time recognized was the torso of a woman that is pregnant, how come the vessel is not looked upon more favorably versus I understand what your point as you were making, Pat, as far as the men are the prime donators to women creating creation basically, but why not just worship the actual vessel that does make that creation? Where did that move, if it ever did?
Well, so I think the anthropological answer is probably the most explanative, right? As people came, in a early agrarian societies of the Mediterranean, fertility, fertility of people, animals, and crops were all conceptually related. So they didn't always have to have the same divinities that oversaw them, but they were often related in how they were projected, or at least understood in the ancient world. So the earliest concepts of fertility were associated with women. Now, as societies become more and more structured and urbanized, cities form, and those cities get bigger, we start seeing patriarchal successions form. Basically, armies and men in power. We see the formation of just not war bands of people, but warlords who become kings. Kings become dynasts. You can see where I'm getting. And then the people that keep them in power are an important elite bodyguard of men for the most part. And then they're soldiers. And so women become fertility, the agricultural context becomes secondary to the urbanization and military aspects of societies in the ancient world. So I think that's the anthropologically explanative answer, but other than that, I can't go much beyond that.
I mean, that's fair. That's a fair explanation. And I think that also, because my brain trailed off to thinking about the polygamy aspects. Why a man would have so many wives, but it would make sense. And of course, the whole aspect of always having sons, because you need that donation to further create and implant into the vessel. I'm describing sex here, folks. So that would make sense as far as that tradition back then, but I wonder why, especially since there's such a decrease, and I'm just speaking on Christian faith here, of the decline of those becoming less believers in the Christian faith and trending on to other faiths or non-faiths. Why didn't they just carry on that ideal?
Well, they did. Last week, an Indian man killed his wife because she was expecting a daughter. So those ideas still exist.
I mean, as far as good point, yes, and I know what you're referring to, but I mean, as far as the polygamous aspects, I know certain Mormon sects, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I confuse my JWs with my Mormons. Certain sects still carry on that kind of tradition.
Amishes as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I may, if you were to look at some extra biblical writings, if you look at the book of Jubilees, Adam and Eve had two daughters, Azora and Avon. And if you combine the Bible with the book of Jubilees, Cain was the first man to have two wives. He took Avon as his wife, and he found another wife in the city of Nob. So right off the bat, from the very beginning, you see polygamy.
Right. And incest.
Well,
and incest, yeah.
I also think the fact that a lot of these books are written by social elites of their day. Remember, it's not the average Joe or Jane writing these texts or commemorating these texts into oral traditions. These are social and societal elites. The projection of polygamy is also one of, again, gender exploitation, but it's also economic exploitation, because I'm rich, I can afford to have more than one wife, and so what I'm doing is then denying that to men in many ways that are my social inferiors. So again, men die in warfare. There's a lot of explanations on why this happens, but women also die at high rates in childbirth. So you want to double down your bet. So I need 2 or 3 wives to make sure I get half a dozen kids to adulthood, because I might lose a wife or two along the way, given the mortality rates in the ancient world. I mean, depending on, there's several scholars on this, but Dr. Blundell is one I rely heavily on her research. You know, women in the ancient world could have anywhere from between 5 to 10% mortality rate per pregnancy, not delivery, pregnancy.
Whew.
So,
Wow.
you know, there were some women that had 8 or 10 kids, and there's some women that died in their first child delivery. Like these, when you start adding that together, you know, each time a woman became pregnant, it literally was a life and death scenario in many instances.
Well, yeah, if you look at what was her not Rebecca, Rachel, I think Rachel and she only had 2 sons and died shortly after giving birth to Benjamin.
And that wasn't uncommon. I mean, in literary, even non-Christian, non-Jewish sources, you know, a lot of, you know, I'm the example coming off my top of my head right now was, you know, is Pompey's wife. Whether or not she was pregnant or not, or if she just was sick, we the historical records kind of, but women just dying, like,
yeah,
you know, just my wife got sick, she died, or my wife got pregnant, she died. My wife delivered, I had a child, but she died. This was a very common trope in the ancient world, and when you just look at gravestones, I mean, just look at, you know, ancient gravestones, and it's like all these young women being depicted holding their children, like, oh, that's so sweet. No, and then you read the inscription, it's because she died in childbirth. Like either her and the child died, or the child died, or she died, and you start piecing these together, and you're realizing these women are pretty young, because they're saying, you know, she was 16, she was 18, she's 27, and a woman at 30, that was towards the end of their childbearing age. So, you know, you talk about modern context, women were expected, like, if you haven't had a kid by 30, you never were. And after about 25, women started getting terrified in the ancient world of conceiving, because mortality rates again started increasing those higher ends for women that approach 30. Yeah. And so there's been a lot of scholarship on it. I mean, it takes a lot of historians and archaeologists going and writing down and translating all these tombstones, and like, and then they start calculating mortality rates, and then realizing these women are dying either very young. Then there's a bracketing in there, in what we call, I don't want to call it middle age, but the middle group, and then towards the later ends, to where you're going, wow, women between, again, 13 and 16 wasn't unheard of to become pregnant in the ancient world, dying during their first or second pregnancy during those ages, and then women in that area around between 28 and 35, right? And this was, you know, we just look at tombstones and inscriptions and heartbroken families, and you know, it's very jarring to see how high those, for, you know, and again, once a woman had 2 or 3 children and successfully had children, she was, you know, you're thinking like, oh, she's a good, not only is she a good mother, she's a good wife, because she's had kids, and if it's likely that she'll have a couple more without complication, right? That was right. I'm not saying it was sound medical thought, but it was thinking, well, her womb is effective. Like, she's got a good womb, so things will work out.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, good on you, producers, for reading my mind, because I was just wanting to talk back to exactly what Ryan was referencing. It still is a today problem, a life and death scenario where, you know, women, no matter what age, obviously more implications and more risks at older age, but there's still a risk factor of not only bearing, but carrying and going through with delivery. I mean, we have, you know, better medical technology to, you know, help with the health of the baby during that, you know, 9-month term of pregnancy, but there's still risks at delivery. You never know how that's going to go. Never.
Well, and every single pregnancy is a risk of death. Every single one.
Right.
Not for that.
And not only that, there's also, and I want to dive into one of the questions that we have here, unless Cindy, you have something further. But one thing I was just thinking as you were speaking, Pat, is, you know, the referencing how young they were, 13 through 16, and you know, maybe sometimes younger than that.
Right.
You know, obviously your body is still developing. Who knows at what point in time a person, you know, goes through that period of going through puberty, and you're putting that young body at risk of dying, and you're in the strain and all that. So the forceful aspects of it, the forceful aspects of having young girls having to bear children for the sake of just bearing children.
Right.
Can I speak on that real quick? Because
Please.
so if you look at, I want to go back to Mary, because some scholars have her as young as 12 years old. And to me, I look at the scriptures and I'm like, yeah, she may have consented, but her prefrontal cortex was not fully developed. Where was the real cognitive understanding of that consent happening? And this is, every Christmas, this is propped up as something to be celebrated. It should be, everybody should be in horror at this. She was 12 years old and forced to be pregnant under the guise of it being this miraculous thing that God's doing. In my opinion, it's like God just raped a 12-year-old.
Exactly. It's exactly how I see it too. And even with finding that out, like you had just mentioned, I can't remember how long ago I actually discovered what scholars really thought her age was, because we all know the classic reference to Islam, where, how young that individual was. And I'm like, well, hell, how young was Mary? Was she 18? No, she was far more younger than that, most scholars would say. So to put it in that aspect, and I've seen at least one movie where they tried to make some type of biblical type of reference in this movie to have this young woman in her early to mid 20s, no less. So that's even way older than what I ever originally thought Mary would have been, to give reference to her being essentially a virgin Mary giving birth. So yeah.
Well, if we go back to, how many children can this wife bear for me, the younger, the better for the guys.
Right. Because she's still in that early prime age before she reaches a certain age, let's just say 30, before she's just not useful, to put it in plain speak.
Yeah, put them out to pasture, if you will, because obviously the Bible doesn't even consider women much higher than the animals. And the animals were Adam's first choice to be a companion. And then, like, as an afterthought, oh, well, maybe I should make somebody for him.
Yeah. I wonder, and we'll go into questions because I had another thought. I apologize. I got excited. Abraham's wife, well up in her age. So that, and also considering not even if it was a woman as old as she was, barren women, how were they treated?
Right. The other one is Hannah. Hannah was mocked by other women because she was barren.
Right.
So
yeah, not even the fact that other women mocked you for Well,
and if you go back to Abraham's wife Sarah, she's not portrayed very well either. She beats her slave Hagar and then puts her out into the desert, and Abraham's like, yeah, whatever you want to do, puts them out in the desert to die, and an angel says, oh no, go back.
Wow.
And then Abraham uses her to get richer twice. That's her benefits. That's her use, basically. Make him richer.
Again, there are a few literary exceptions, and whether or not they're credible, that's a different issue. But women that were non-reproductive or were unable to bear children largely had no value socially in the ancient world. I mean, and I'm putting it bluntly because you said speak to real, Pat. So that was again Greek and Roman system, which is paralleling Judaism at this time when we're talking about post Second Temple period all the way through the early Christian era. One of the reasons in a non-Christian system you could divorce your wife was inability to have children. Like, oh, she's unable to produce, I have a legal out. that was a perfectly justifiable explanation for divorce in a non-Christian system. The Christians do.
Never mind that it could have been the man.
Oh, it's almost, and it was likely was. I mean, but it was in this non-scientific age. It was the vessel wasn't good for holding the seed. That's how it was generally saw.
Right.
But for Christian, it's that's a justification for the sanctity of marriage, because marriage exists to reproduce. So if the woman cannot reproduce, then the marriage shouldn't exist, basically.
Null and void. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because Christianity has a problem with their theology. We're talking early Christian church. I'm not talking anything after the 6th century, by the way. I'm drawing that line. But women can't divorce. So what do you do? What do you do? Again, I'm gonna put on my 3rd century male brain. So this is not Pat, but I'm a Christian. My wife can't reproduce. I can't divorce her because of our theology. What purpose does she have? Well, at least in the Roman system, you could adopt. Adoption was a totally viable legal way around this.
Nice. Okay.
And by the way, if you were rich and powerful, adoption was actually in some cases preferred because you could pick your heir. But then, in the Roman legal system, when you adopt someone, they separated themselves completely legally from their former family as well. That's like, again, I use the classic example everybody knows about Julius Caesar and Octavian, who becomes Caesar Augustus, right? The adoption makes him his son in all ways. Mm-hmm. So these are the kind of important distinctions. But again, Christianity had an issue. What do you do with women who aren't medically fertile? Well, there has to be ways around it. But again, women, what many as it projected in Christianity in the early part of the church, is women that are infertile. Now it's an issue of sin. It's an issue. You're not fertile because of something you've done. Otherwise, God would be putting his bounty upon you. Because remember, again, I don't want to quote scripture, but it's in my book. We look at Timothy, right? Timothy 2:15, it talks about men have to be just doing what they do, but women have to be obedient and have children in order to be saved. It's a dual thing. Women aren't just saved by faith. Women are saved by
childbearing. Yeah.
Right. In addition to obedience to their husband and propriety, which basically means non-permissible sex only with your husband, and bearing of children. So women in the early Christian church had an additional theological requirement for salvation that did not pertain to men. And I think people miss that's an issue in the 2nd century.
I miss that. Shit.
Right. So, but we also should look back, and if I were still in theology, I would be pointing back to the Old Testament that also talks about God closing the wombs of women. So it's like, he opens and he closes, right? So for me, it'd be like, okay, well, maybe it's a time and a purpose and a season, and now's not the right time. So God has closed my womb. That's my Christian hat, right? But
of course,
but
that
would be my argument. Like, don't put me out to pasture. This might be God's will.
Similar aspect or thought when God hardens Ramesses' heart. It's the same thing. Like, you didn't have to do that. The Lord can be as willing as he, him, whatever she wants to, in this regard, to open up a woman's womb or to not harden another person's heart just by his own, omni whatever presence alone. So why not in this case? And the fact that he knows everything that would happen thereafter, it's almost a game. It's a purposeful game to God to do this, just for whatever sick reason that God has. But I digress. We do have, unless yes, go ahead, Cindy, and I'll jump in.
I wanted to go back to the present, even though that's not exactly the topic of the show, but a lot of women have internalized this submissive mentality, whether it's in Christianity or Islam or other religions. How can we help them get out of this way of thinking?
That's important.
That's the $1 million question.
Yeah, I think for me, like it again, it hits to home because I have a sister that just got married almost a year ago, and I still on occasion still go to church because I'm, that's my opportunity to see my mother, and also I'm still closeted, so it's a double pronged sword for me. But ever since her being married and us seeing our church family, quote unquote, it's always the, oh, where's the baby, always kind of when I feel the stomach and everything, and I'm like, that's just the most uncomfortable situation ever, and I hurt for her because I could see the uncomfortability on her face. And so I would, as close to home as that my goal with being with my sister and hanging out with her more and things like that is, it's okay to not feel forced or ready for something financially or whatever that you're not ready for. Like, you've already went through this financial of just having the wedding. And so this other aspect of our lives where, she's older than I am, I'm 32. And then, she's already at or nearing that age of, it's becoming more difficult to bear a child. Not that saying that she cannot, but that's what she wants. And, I hope for that for her. But I think we can do ourselves justice just to our neighbor, just to someone closest to us, to say, these ideals that we were raised up on or what is taught to us through scripture, you don't have to be beholden to that. You do on your own time for yourself and what you can survive on and do for yourself and, of course, your partner. Because I'm sure that may be the case for him too. So, I mean, that's my part in having that encouraging conversation with her. And I kind of will have that conversation with her again later. Just to try to block out those things of people hoping or wanting to see you have a bigger stomach the next time they see you in church.
Yeah, there was this story a couple of weeks ago in India where a couple of parents sued their son because after all the money they gave to him, he didn't have a child, so they sued him. And that's exactly what you're talking about. We need to explain people that you don't owe anyone anything. Just because you raised a child doesn't mean this child owes you anything.
Right.
And it's whether it's a child, whether it's support when you're sick, or it's not, it shouldn't be mandatory.
Right.
You
Right.
don't owe them. If you want, if you can, yes, perfect. But you shouldn't have to.
You shouldn't live your life for someone else.
Exactly.
That brings to mind a story that I experienced when my son was very, very young. He was just a few months old, I think. And I was a youth pastor's wife. And the pastor came to me and he says, you'd be perfect. I want you to take over the nursery and run the nursery. And I said, no. And he came back to me like 4 or 5 times. And the last time he was very exasperated and he's like, I just don't understand why you wouldn't just jump at this. And this is perfect for you. And I just think you'd be great at it. And I said, look, you don't want me there. I shouldn't have to explain myself. But for one, this was non-paying. I'm a new mom. I don't have time off. You never get time off as a new mom. But to expect me, just because of who I'm married to and my position in the church, to take over this role was like, where are your boundaries? The church has no boundaries.
Oh, that's disgusting. I hate that you went through that.
I was glad that my mom had actually sent me that book like a year before called Boundaries. And I was able to say no 5 times.
I'm gonna need that book from you.
Sorry, I already loaned it out like 20 times, but I didn't get it back last time.
I'm gonna get a link later.
I think we need to remember that what religion does in these systems is reinforce cultural norms, right?
Yeah.
So if you live in a culture where women are expected to be subordinated to men, the religions project that typically. And they reinforce these systems. And then it's amazing how the theology follows right after the cultural norms that are in place. Imagine that. And then it reinforces it, right? And in some ways it exploits it, but really when we see, like, again, when we see Christians, churches being misogynistic, are they being misogynistic because they're Christians? Maybe. Are they being misogynist? Are they misogynist because they're misogynists and they're trained within a cultural system that for young men pushed them towards misogynistic patriarchal worldview, and given the patriarchal society and the slant towards patriarchy that we come from, this is just systems that are reinforced, and then religious systems seem to reinforce those as well. And the fact that this patriarchy that is still being clung to is from the Bronze Age, we're pushing it forward, and it was just reinforced. Each iteration of it is problematic, and we haven't gotten past. If we were designing a society today, we sat down at a table, we were going to write down the pros and cons of what we want our society. Equality of the sexes would have been the first thing that we would say. Everybody's equal, right? We define adulthood, self-autonomy, but we don't have that because we have a legacy of culture that is, got roots, 3,000-5,000 years, depending how far back you want to go.
Yeah, and if this God was benevolent, truly benevolent, that would have been top of his list too,
right?
Because he would have known your omni everything, right? You would have known that society would evolve to understand that women should be equal to men,
unless
and not that physically. Of course, we're not physically identical. But me having a vagina does not interfere with my ability to comprehend information, nor does it diminish my value.
See, I would argue that for the misogynist, God's a male. Women were cursed with childbirth, right? That you go back to we go back to Genesis, right? Like if you want to be a misogynist, God's a man. Why do we call God he? Because he's a man, and I'm a man, so I'm closer to God than a woman. Right, like you can get into a misogynist head. Just eat 2 asshole pills, and you're good.
Yeah,
and that's how you do it.
I love that rabbit trail. I loved it. That was good, Pat.
I love it too.
Yeah, and it's the same question we ask very often. It's like when we talk about Christ to fascism, we say, are they Christian because they're racist, or are they racist because they're Christians?
Yes.
And that's always the same question.
Yeah.
Wow.
See, what's funny is a Christian who's not a racist is going to say they're not a racist because they're Christian. See how that circular logic, because it reinforces the culture that they identify with. You go to this progressive Christian church, let's just, we won't, and the progressive Christians are pro-LGBTQ, anti-racism, progressive in their politics. That's reinforcing that culture. They're using that religious system to project that cultural norm in that community. Outside that community, you go to the knuckle draggers, and next thing you know is you have, homosexuality is a sin. Women need to know their place. They're not to talk in church. Only men can be priests or leaders, and that reinforces that cultural system.
And this is why I fail to see why the Bible is not considered too old for the time now. Because I remember hearing this argument from a Black Christian apologist that I reviewed like roughly about a few weeks ago, where she had referenced one of the 9 reasons of why a person would become atheist is because, the Bible is not relevant or it's too old for its time. And I'm like, these are one of the points. Just simply looking at the 10 commandments, just ignoring the Levitical laws and all the parables and stories of these women and stories of what happens to women and why, it's kind of like, well, if God was omni everything and benevolent at that, like you were saying, Deborah, he would have the forethought to know what the future, like you were saying, what the future will be like now, and have altered and made scripture, if it's, truly God breathed, to effectively address those things.
Well,
or make corrections along the way as societies change and grow.
Right. So he apparently abhors unequal weights and measures when it comes to money. But apparently women are even less valuable than money.
Who would have thought? Yes, happy Pride Month.
Well, I think we could fix it all. We can fix misogyny today. We just go into an edible version of the Old and New Testament, and everywhere it says God, we just replace it with goddess. And think about the cultural shift that would do, right? Like if the prime deity is a goddess, then women can more closely associate their role in society with the prime deity. Like we can fix it like that. So
yeah.
There, everybody on YouTube, you now have the answer. Find and replace in your version, your PDF.
I'm gonna go to questions now. This is I love this. I enjoyed this discussion by all means. I think we kept it to the point of the topic, but also brought it in the way to just get a full kind of circle of understanding, because it helped me just like, what are the origins of this? Why this? How are these people treated? I appreciate that. And yes, I would agree with Oz. Pat looks exceptionally lovely this afternoon.
Well, thank you.
Let's go to questions. The first one from Ryan Cultastic. Hi, Ryan. At Skeptic Haven, what about the 4 women who prophesied that Paul spoke about? Acts 21:7. I'm not having my Bible, so take it away.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that passage right off the top of my head. So, but
actively Googling
Paul says a lot about women, and none of it's really good. So, I mean, while you might have a specific set of scriptures or passages that oh wow, yay, his later writings, I don't even know if Paul wrote in Acts. He didn't write Acts, did he? Luke and Acts were written by the same author, and right. So. Yeah, sorry.
So I have a part. I'll read from my book because I actually answer this question.
Perfect.
As brief as Anna and Mary's accounts are, the next perhaps briefest account of prophetic women within the New Testament is found within the book of Acts 21:8-9, which describes Philip the evangelist. He's given a name, who had 4 unmarried daughters who had the gift of prophecy. This account fails to provide the names of any of Philip's divinely gifted daughters, and then I go on from there. But yeah, there's 4. And it's in there, but these women go without name. Now, interestingly enough, later church tradition creates names and histories for these women, but this isn't until like the 5th and 6th century. And they're all added narratives, but none of those narratives are actually included within the canon. They're all, either church tradition or texts that aren't considered canonical. So, again, we could talk about them all day. I devote quite a bit of time to women prophetesses. Like one thing I like is that some of these minority movements, and I mean minority as far as sex within Christianity, were pro women. Like we had churches in early Christianity led by women. We have demonstrable places in the archaeological and literary record where women were bishops of churches. Now they're declared heretical. And by the 4th and 5th century, these women are no longer allowed to be. But from the late 2nd into 3rd century, and even maybe into the 4th, we had churches led by women where women were acting. One of the movements is known as the New Prophecy movement. But these are, you have women sometimes in pairs or singularly acting as the prophetic heads of Christian churches. And I mean Christian as in Christ is the guy. He came from heaven. He's our savior. Churches that are then later denounced as heretical because the women are the key leaders, or at least in a social role similar to men, and they were declared heretical for those reasons. So when you start looking at this, there were oppositions to some of these cultural stereotypes. And I think what happened is you see Greco-Roman society and the remnants of Jewish society absorb these cultural motifs of patriarchal requirements and then project them through the new developing theology of Christianity. And so now that's why Christianity looks the way it does, even though there were some ebbs and flows where women were given prominent roles, because out of the pagan system, women could be priests in certain religious traditions, and women could hold. So, Christianity was working itself through this 3 centuries of what do we do with women? And some churches, they were like, well, women have been priestesses for a long time. We'll let them be priestesses in our new church. We had female bishops. Paul refers to a female apostle. And what's funny is in the Middle Ages, they tried to write her out of the New Testament. Paul talks about Jena. Well, then apologists come in and go, not apologists, but theologians of their day go, yeah, Junia, that's a woman's name, and she's being referred to as being equal or one of the apostles. Got to change that. They must mean that it's a guy's name, Junius. So they changed the gender of the word. It's like, oh, it's not Mark, it's not Michael, it's not Michelle, it's Michael. Well, no, in the original text it says Michelle. Well, we're going to change it because obviously they're wrong. But you have a text that says it. Well, it couldn't be a woman because our theology won't line up with it. And now we have copies, and it's gone back. And there's been a lot of discussion academically on, well, if Paul's talking about women in all these key leadership roles, I'm just saying we'll refer to Romans as being accurate historically, so to speak. But he's even in his own notations making women into deaconesses, and at least one case an apostle. We have archaeological data to support that at least in a few places in the Roman world, women were bishops of churches. So wait a minute, why'd this all dry up and go away? Because by the 5th century, the patriarchy had determined no women. Women are to be subjugated and have no role in the church outside those that are specifically delineated for men, by men, okay, for women.
Right. So,
yeah.
Real quick.
Mm-hmm.
So this just goes to my whole thought about the Tower of Babel. So if God was omnicoherent, he would not have confused the languages so that everybody could read the text in its original language and understand it, but he didn't.
Well, but see, God didn't do it. It was some.
I know.
It was some Hebrew. It was some.
For argument's sake.
I love that because I get that question once in a while. I get like I'll be teaching a class on history, right? And they'll be like, "What about Tower of Babel?" And then I have to stop and remember I'm in a teaching setting, right? And I'll go, "Well, what's more explanative as someone starting off your academic career that God did all this, or some Hebrew trying to project why his culture is more important?" Because remember, God's language just happens to be Hebrew, the same language that our people speak. And that, you're looking at the world and you're this tiny little group of people in Palestine, and you have to explain why everybody else, these great nations around you, speak a language that's not yours. Well, God did it, but we're special.
Right.
Exactly.
Across the pieces. Yeah.
Right.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's see. If you don't mind reading the next question for us, Cindy. I think it's from Aaron.
Even though women were denigrated in the AME, I don't know what that is, and its literature, do we see any evidence of women exerting influence through their husbands or other male relatives?
Yeah, sort of. In the book of Esther, it talks about Esther, having this huge banquet, but she repeated this banquet 3 days in a row just to get the confidence to speak to the king and plead on behalf of her people. So yeah, there are evidences of influence, but I mean, if you're looking at that, it's like, wow, this queen was cowering for 3 days. He must have had a temper. Otherwise, you would have no qualms just approaching, having a banquet, and then that night you approach the king on behalf of your people. I don't know why it took 3 days. I mean, I know why the text alludes to a different narrative, but I mean, it doesn't even paint that specific storyline in a very good light for women.
It's like women in science. We only now start realizing that a lot of discoveries supposedly made by men were actually made by women and then taken over. But we can discover it now because we have evidence, we have testimonies, we have papers, but it's hard to get the same thing from 3,000 years ago.
Well, and I mean, if you look at Queen, was it Vishtar? I think it was Vish. What was her name? The queen that Esther succeeded.
Are you asking me? Because that's outside my area of expertise, especially.
Well, I think it was Vishtar, the queen. She didn't want to do what the king requested. He just wanted to show her off as a trophy wife, right? oh, she hasn't been in front of my men or the people. She hasn't approached. Okay, so she didn't want to. Big deal. And then she was vilified for it and replaced.
Right. So we don't know. And I think, do we want to project that maybe women were working behind the scenes? Because we can take other examples from history from other time periods and say, well, we know that these women in history did X behind the scenes in their patriarchal system. So obviously it happened in the ancient Near East and other places in antiquity. And I would say that's probably a reasonable assumption. But the problem is, if you're actually relying on the literary and historical record, we don't have any, right? Or we have very few. So we can assume, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question in a way that is demonstrable, other than we can assume that it happened in other places, and it probably happened. I could see a strong-willed woman in the 5th century BCE in Palestine telling her husband, this is the way shit's going to be, and him going along with it. But that would be abnormal too. And the fact that she did it, she had limitations culturally on how far she could push it. Like, that's just the reality of cultural systems in general. There are intrafamilial limitations, how far I as an individual can push, and then there are cultural limitations, right? I mean, that's pretty good.
Right. Well, and also, why would a woman have to go through her husband to exert influence? Just that very question alone shows that there was a problem with equality back then, obviously.
It has to do with, again, legal and social standing in the culture. Like, why would you have to go? Again, weren't Roman women allowed to testify in court without special consideration of the Senate, specifically because women weren't considered reliable witnesses and didn't have citizenship of their own? So
right.
These are, and it was very similar in other systems throughout the ancient world.
That's a fascinating question. Something I thought along the lines of, like, seeing, and this has nothing to do with scripture, but seeing certain TV shows of maybe the mother, if the husband had died, raising up the son and speaking through him in order to create some type of control or reign. I always had that, fantastical idea, but I mean, that's fair. Who knows if that was ever a situation at any point through this. But another question here from Skeptic Haven himself. Okay. Was there any examples of a more egalitarian, there we go, just sound it out, egalitarian society in the Mediterranean Sea, or where there are all that patriarchal BS at that time? I butchered that, but yeah.
So not all societies were the same in the, and we can, again, these criteria are extremely subjective. When we look at gender roles in the ancient world, we look at societies, and it's not, and we can stick to just the ancient Mediterranean, because I don't know anything outside the Mediterranean, so let's just be quiet. The issue being, like, we do see societies that we would go by today's standards, that society is more egalitarian than its contemporary neighbor. You can make those comparisons, and that's pretty fair. It's generally considered, like the ancient Celts, for example, women had a pretty dominant role compared to their Roman neighbors. The Romans actually complained that the Celts weren't real men because they let their women do too much of the politics, right? Because Celtic society had again, it was patriarchal, but the roles of women reached a more comparable level of parity. For example, most kings that we know of in Celtic society were men, and I mean leaders, but there were women, queens, that are prominently featured in the historical record. Most of the Celtic diplomats that interacted with the Romans during the period of before wars and after wars were often men, but sometimes they were women. And we have at least one historical precedent where a very powerful Celtic tribe sent a emissary, and it was either a daughter of a king or a daughter-in-law. It's kind of, depending on how you want to translate. But they sent this woman who was prominent among her people to represent her people among the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate, we're not talking to a fucking woman. Send her away. Bring back a man. So, we a lot of these are inferences. We look at clannish societies, the role of women in clannish societies, their modern equivalent, project that a little bit back into historical record. And so, were their societies better than the Greeks and Romans and ancient Palestinians? Absolutely. Were they were they societies that women would want to live in today? Well, if you had to choose, yeah, you would choose them, but they're still not the equivalent of what we're looking for today. They would still be considered patriarchal and in many cases misogynistic.
The only biblical woman that I have found that is painted in any kind of good light is the Queen of Sheba, who went to King Solomon and wanted to know, what do you know? Teach me, tell me. He entertained her. Now, she was a queen. She was not a commoner. She was not his wife. She was not a concubine. She was a queen in her own right. And that is what gave her nobility and respect from King Solomon himself. And she's probably the only person in the scriptures that I've seen that have been really, really all the way around given a good picture.
You're right about that, because again, recalling my young girl days in the church, Queen Sheba was number one as far as she obviously portrayed as a strong Black woman in Egypt, but she was given that portrayal of having the pride, a womanly, feminine pride to hold her own and all this other stuff. So yeah, you recalled a lot from me just speaking.
And it doesn't say that she was traveling with a man that was speaking for her or sitting there with her. It looked like she traveled by herself, except for her court.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, great question. I like that one. And of course, Aaron's. That was quite interesting just hearing your responses. Next one, did you want to read that one, Cindy?
And yeah, that's a very interesting question as well. Why aren't women named in the New Testament? I have a feeling that they were more important to the movement before the elite wrote them out. Were they really all named Mary or Martha or Mary Magdalena or
right?
Every woman was Mary.
So I'm gonna assume I don't necessarily agree they were written out. I don't know if they were written in. We don't know. I mean, we if you're assuming they're written out, then I would say we'd have to we'd do some intense textual criticism on that. But I think by the 2nd century, when we have the pastorals being written, remember, no serious scholar thinks that the pastorals, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus were written in the 1st century. Most people put them between 120 and 140. So women were already, it's time to get the women out of the church, because those are very suppressive texts for women, because there were 2nd century movements that were, again, either more egalitarian or led by women. So these tensions in Christianity in the 2nd century are to get rid of women. So a lot of the texts that become canonized are pro-patriarchal texts, and the pro-feminine texts, if you want to call them that, are all declared either non-canonical or heretical. And non-canonical can be something you can look at occasionally, gain some inspiration from, but it's not canon. Heretical are like, these texts are actually preaching a false gospel, which gets you into a whole nother bed of hot water. And there were a lot of texts out there that were presenting, like the Gnostic Gospels, a lot of them project women in a role, like depending on which particular gospel you're reading. Some of the texts portray Mary as equal in like a divine aspect to God. Other cases, we have Mary Magdalene literally the 12th but number 1 disciple. Like, these are not uncommon in other traditions that did not make it into orthodoxy. So when people talk about early Christianity, which Christianity are you talking about? Because there were a lot, and different sects competing for dominance.
Which is why we have over 44,000 denominations now, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But the Bible is the inerrant word of God, right?
I would ask which Bible.
Right.
There we go. Yeah, good point there. Well, thank you for shedding some light on that, Pat. Our final question here comes from one of our gracious, awesome producers, Courageous Correa. Cray Cray all day. That's my nickname. What about someone help me because I'm not going to pronounce Thecla. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say Thecla. That's not right. What about Thecla? I didn't even learn about her until I became an atheist. And I only, you know what? That's a good point because I only referenced Thecla even myself after becoming an atheist. So yeah.
Well, she's one of these key figures in outside of the script, outside of the canonical scriptures, right? Thecla is a companion, early adherent follower of Paul. She, she's this big figure, right? She's so important in the 4th century. She has an entire book written about her, right? And she's this, I call her the apostle plus one, right? She's able to baptize herself, right? She has a whole story of her life where she is this divine attribute and association to the early Christian church that, I mean, you can go, like, I've actually gone to places in Bulgaria where you see inside early Christian cave systems that were churches, depictions of Thecla, right? And the other associated figures of early Christianity that are women that don't have their stories perpetuated. But she was extremely popular that she was canonized and then decanonized in a way. I don't mean formally within the church, but she was a popular figure where her books and other accounts of her life were read as if they were scripture. Then they were later removed, particularly from the Eastern churches, because they were seen as countercultural to this patriarchal requirement. Because if Thecla can lead men and Thecla can baptize, then women can baptize and women can lead. So you can't have her being the equal of an apostle.
Trouble.
Yeah. Yay.
Oh, go ahead.
I always think of the books upon Thecla. Everyone goes, well, describe what it is. I'm like, well, it should be called The Adventures of Thecla, right? Because it's this fantastic story. She gets thrown into a fish tank and almost eaten by killer seals. It's kind of amazing. You actually gotta watch it.
A bad A.
Well, I don't watch it. Read it. I actually say you can't watch it unless Netflix is hurting for subscribers. They might make the movie.
Maybe they are. Who knows? Maybe that should be something. That should be a new adventure for you, Pat Lowinger. Upon I don't know if this is recent completion of your own book, titled "Betrayed: The Orthodox Subjugation of Women in the Early Christian Church," referencing 2nd to 6th century CE. If you can give us a little tidbit about that as we wrap up this portion of the show.
Well, please. I wrote it not because I wanted to. I wrote it because I needed to. I needed to show that I could approach something very much out of my comfort zone. So up to this point, I've written about stuff I've wanted to write about or I was told to write about within an academic framework. This was, again, advice on an advisor said, hey, you're how old? I go, at the time I started, I was 51. You're 51 years old. Write a book that's going to challenge you so you can get your, I'm a late academic, late into scholarship. So his suggestion was, what's your least comfortable thing that you talk about? He already knew the answer. He's like, you're not as strong on feminist frameworks and methodological and feminist theory. I'm not, I admit it. It's like, the books that I droll like, oh my gosh, I got to read another book. Right. And so I don't know much about it. So I had to learn about it. I then talked about a subject matter. I'm a cis white male talking about a variety of women in the ancient world that were from a variety of cultural groups, some that looked like me, some that looked very different than me, and try to do the best I could. And it really changed some of my worldview, even from what I thought was my educated worldview. Now I'm realizing that, I joke and I go, well, men are assholes. And it's historically true. Men are assholes. But when I look at the Christian church, I actually see this methodological dismantling of any independence, both in a legal system, which was the Roman system, the cultural system, which was largely Mediterranean, and then the theological system. Like they all rolled into one big snowball that just at the bottom of the hill crushed women for the next 2,000 years.
Very interesting to dive because you had referenced certain parts that were to people you personally know that would be very difficult to read. But I think even the most difficult of subject matter needs to be read. It needs to. So we get a full understanding of the atrocity and the full understanding of how, things like this still in modern times in some degree occur and harm women.
Well, so I mean, I don't want to push my book too much, but so like I devote an entire chapter to domestic violence in the ancient world. I think it's important. I think it's to understand what happened in the early Christian church that both addressed it and then reinforced some very bad cultural norms, and in many ways changed society. When Christianity comes onto the stage, women had a certain amount of rights under the Roman legal system and largely the systems that were in the Mediterranean. By the time the 6th century closes, at the end of my analysis, women have no options, or so few options to really have none, culturally and legally and theologically, because religion and culture were inseparable. So you couldn't say, well, my culture is not my religion, because it was the same thing. I also address issues regarding conception and abortion in the ancient world. Again, another chapter that when you read it, you go, because we have to talk about the requirement of women in this system to be fruitful and multiply. And that's actually what I call that particular chapter. But I put a disclosure on my chapter on domestic violence because I thought again, for those that know, I'm a former law enforcement officer. So I approached it like I was a detective, right? And I realized when I stepped back out of the chapter and got some feedback from colleagues, they're like, this is too graphic. You need to tone this down. I toned down the language without changing the information. But ultimately, I think it still delivers. And I still think I needed to warn my readers that it's pretty graphic in its nature. I talk, I try to cover, I don't talk about Greeks, Romans, and others in the same context that I talk about Palestinian Jews. I devote chapters to each of those so you can talk about the cultures of the women in those two disparate cultural groups in many reasons. I talk about women that were outside. Like, let's talk about the tradition of women in the heretical sects. Like, how prominent were these women? Why was there such a movement to get rid of the heretics? Because in many of those sects, women had pronounced roles. Like, if you were going to be a misogynist, you got to get rid of your competition, particularly if they're saying, well, no, women can be priests or priestesses, right? If you're not for that, you got to get rid of them. And a lot of the detractions against sects that were somewhat pro-women, I'm not going to say they were fully egalitarian, because there's issues with the scholarship, right? But if you're going to get rid of these sects that seem to be more pro-women than you want, the first thing you do is you accuse the women, not the men, the women of impropriety, immorality, all of the tropes of that period, to basically say these women, they're liars, thieves, and whores. That's when you roughly translate from the original Latin and Greek, that's what you're getting, right? So
I think that'd be a wonderful, fantastic look at all those aspects that you just laid out. And I'm looking forward to when you let us know when it'll be available to us.
I'll have more information when I get back from the summer excavation, because by then I can sit down with the editor again, get some final dates. But we're hoping to get it into the printers so that it'll be out before the end of the year.
Nice. By all means, we're going to look out for that, and we're going to tote that book until we get those final dates. But, presently, Deborah Grace, you have a book, fantastically so, Crucifying the Bible.
And I'm writing my second one.
Oh, yes. And exactly. And you're on to writing the second one. By all means, if any of us haven't grabbed a copy of that, then by do so. And when do we expect part 2 or the second book to?
Well, the second one is very much associated to everything we talked about today. But my second book it talks about oppression. It talks about psychology and juxtaposes the scriptures against psychology. But there's 4 main topics that I hit, and one of them is oppression of women. Then there's slavery, there's mind control, and the treatment of children. And those 4 topics are hit pretty heavily throughout. I'm more than halfway done. Hopefully, I should have it published by the end of the year as well.
Nice. So we got something to look forward to in 2020.
And
2022. Well,
put them in people's stockings at Christmas, because that nothing brings cheer and harmony into a family gathering than a book that talks about the suppression of women.
Oh, it fills my heart with joy.
Right?
Or the oppressive nature of religion.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
And 'tis the season, I tell you.
I get to see now someone opening Deborah Grace's book. What do you mean Mary was 12 years old? That's going to start a conversation. And little kids opening presents and then family throwing shit at each other. That'd be pretty fun.
What do you
Biblical
mean
women of
God
Christian.
needed foreskins?
Oh man.
Yeah.
Well, by all means, appreciate both you, Pat Lowinger and Deborah Grace, for being here. I freaking enjoyed this conversation. Chat, folks, viewers, if you haven't already, you can follow them on Facebook and Twitter. We've linked all of their social medias and websites in the description down below, as well as referencing where you can purchase Crucifying the Bible from Deborah Grace. And we'll, of course, do our due diligence and keep you all posted when their books come out, so you can have that for your children this Christmas. It should be a Christmas gift. Final thoughts from you, Cindy.
I'm glad we had this topic, because we, as atheists, tend to speak a lot about how women are silenced in the Bible, but we don't provide arguments or positions for that, and that's what tonight was about. So yeah, I think it's interesting to have those discussions, and like I said, we need to talk about this also to women who have internalized it, because they need to realize how oppressed they are, but they don't realize it. So yeah.
Yes, I agree. It's hard to work out. My final thoughts on that, just stemming off from what you just said, Cindy, it's it's hard to work out those things alone, and I did up until a point until I eventually found this community roughly 4 years ago, when I officially deconverted. And so working through that process by myself, knowing what suppressive thoughts or things I thought I should do with my life, but I don't necessarily have to do, and living my life through someone else's lenses when I should just living for myself. And now at 32, finally freaking realizing, you can have your own life and you don't have to do this, and this because society or family says so. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know that was a thing. Do that due diligence if you've come to terms with that. And if you're comfortable, by all means, don't force yourself. If you're comfortable with having that conversation with a neighbor or a family member that is a woman that has these internalized ideals that which we have spoken of today, by all means have that conversation, because you don't know what great fruitful effort or inspiration you can pose on someone else's life for them. Maybe, and this is not a strife for pulling them out of religion. This is just a strife of demonstrating that you can be your own person and you don't have to feel guilty or ashamed of it. And I think that's the most important note and factor to all this. But again, thank you to my lovely co-host, Cindy Plaza, for being here, along with our beautiful, extravagant guest, Deborah Grace, who looks fabulous in orange. I'm going to say that forever. And of course, the ever lovely looking this afternoon, Pat Lowinger, the great archaeologist. I'm just going to say it. I appreciate, our producers in the backstage, Wes and Correa, for running the show and helping us with this show, but also our producers in the chat. I see you, Kat, the humanist, and of course, Phil. Also great producers, administrators, orchestrators of everything we do here on Skeptic Haven, and especially here on Women Atheists Unload. By all means, if you haven't done so, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook. We have great helpful groups, not only providing information for both those that want to keep themselves more closeted for safety reasons and those are more open. So we have different groups for that. So find out with our links below. Support us at our Patreon. Support us once we eventually get to striving to be 1,000 subscribers, when we can make you channel members to continue to subscribe and support. Hit the notification bell for all of our shows that we have throughout the week, but especially including this one. So remember that. But until then, thank you all so much for tuning in, and our guests. And of course, by all means, we have a booking team, Aaron and Shane Billowitz. I know Shane is indisposed right now because he's feeling ill. He got the Rona. No, it's kidding. He put that out there. That's why I'm just saying that. But Shane, I hope you continue to feel better. Aaron, by all means, you're a booker and part of this team as well with Skeptic Haven. By all means, I do not want to forget that also. So thank you. But until then, we will see you all next week with Women Atheists Unload here at Skeptic Haven. Have a good night.
But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, baby, you'll get sick of being the monster out of my head, under my bed. Think you're something out of my nightmares, standing right there. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, then will you get bored of killing me?
Silhouettes of you are like a taunt. Never really know just what you want. With you I don't ever feel calm. I can feel the sweat inside my palms. Play with me like cats and a string. You don't understand the pain it brings. You don't ever wanna give me wings. You don't ever wanna set me free. You know I'm addicted to you, and it's twisted, you've been gifted with the evil voodoo. Got me coming back for more, even when I've been screwed. Dolls full of pins, pierce my heart straight through. I got issues in my head, I like you in my bed, but you keep me on red. Oh, everything is like a test, I better not text or I'll come off dead.